Beruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Chof Hei Amud Beis, starting with Chof Hei Amud Aleph, 6 lines from the bottom. The Gemara previously had told us that when you have a karpef greater than 2 saw, there's ways of minimizing it so that the space is less than 2 saw, and you can then go ahead and metaltel freely within the karpef. For example, it said if you build an amud with certain dimensions, or if you are tachtit by putting mud or clay on the walls in certain circumstances, that will minimize the space that the walls are enclosing. Says the Gemara now, what happens when you have a karpef that also has part of it to be roofed? Does that minimize the space as well or not? Says the Gemara, karpef base shalosh vikira boy base saw. You have altogether 3 saw. The karpet that is uncovered is 2 saw, while you have a roof of 1 saw. Says the Gemara, Rava Omar Avir Keruyoy Miyatroi. Rava is of the opinion that the avir, the space of the covered part, the roof, is going to then add on to the karpet, whereby it'll be an entire 3 saw. Rabbi Zera Omar Ein Avir Keruyoy Miyatroi, whereas Rabbi Zera argues and says that the roof part is now distinct and separate from the unroofed part, whereby you only have a 2 saw karpef, and you go ahead and metaltil freely within that karpef. Says the Gemara, Lema Rav of Rabbi Zera Peplukto de Rav Ushmuel Kamefliki. Let us suggest that their machlekes is really a machlekes between Rav and Shmuel as follows. The Itmar, Achsadra Babika, if you have an Achsadra in a Bika, unlike an Achsadra in a Chatzar, which is normally an Achsadra that has a wall that is adjacent to it and is open on 3 sides. Here we're talking about an Achsadra in a Bika. And therefore we're talking about an Achsadra that is held up with 4 beams, and it has a flat roof of planked, let's say, wooden planks that are on top of it as its roof, but there are no walls. It's completely airy and without any walls that are on of this achsadra. It's in a bika, and the bika we know is a large field and has the din of a karmelis. So the machlok is as follows: Rav Omar muter letaltilo bekula. Rav is the opinion that you can metaltil freely in this area of the achsadra, even though it's in a bika. V'Shmuel Amar Ein Metaltlin Ele B'Daled Amos, whereas Shmuel says no, it's like the Carmelis, and therefore it has a limitation to only be able to metaltel within Daled Amos, but not beyond. Rav Amar Mutal Taltel B'Kula Amrinon Pitikra Yared V'Soisim. The reason why Rav says that you can go ahead and metaltel freely in this achsadra is because the roof at the edges you can go ahead and halachically lower them to make a mechitza. So therefore it has mechitzas on all sides of this achsadra, whereby you can go to metaltel freely within the achsadra. Shmuel Amar Ein Metaltel El Ba'arba Amos Lo Yamrinon Pitikra Yored V'Soisim. Whereas Shmuel argues and says we do not say that you have this halachic wall of Pitikra Yored V'Soisim, and therefore it's like it's in the Bika, which is in a Carmelis, and therefore you cannot metaltel beyond Dalid Amos. So we want to suggest that Rabbi Zera, who says over here that when it comes to the 2 saw karpef and a 1 saw that is roofed, we're suggesting that he holds like Rav, that the roof, we say pitikra yarei v'soisim, it separates itself from the karpef, whereby you're left with only a 2 saw karpef. Whereas the opinion of Rava would go like Shmuel and says we do not say pitikra yard v'soisim. We're on top of Chof Hei Amud Beis. There's the Gemara ida avido ki achsadro hochenami. If we would say that the karpef that we're talking about is an achsadro, meaning it has a flat roof, then everybody, including Rava, would agree. We would say pitikra v'soisim, and therefore it would then separate itself from the rest of the karpef. However, hachab mayaskinin da avda ki orzila. But over here, we're discussing a case where the karpef is like a shed. That means that the roof is not a flat roof, rather it's a slanted roof. And thereby there's a machlokes whether we say pitikra yarid v'soisim or not. according to Rabbi Zeir, we still say Pitika Yari V'Soisim, whereas according to Rava, we do not. Nonetheless, Rabbi Zeir says, even though I say that the roof that is slanted is also going to then be separated from the rest of the karpef, nonetheless, says Rabbi Zeir, Omar Rabbi Zeir, Umodina, but I would agree, Bekarpef shenifrat b'meloyoi l'chotzer she'oser, that a karpef that is opened entirely, that means one wall of the karpef is entirely breached into a chotzer, that is going to be osir. So you have a karpef, which is more narrow than the chotzer that is breached into, whereby if you have the karpef and the wall of the karpef completely is breached, the whole thing is then has fallen down, is completely not there, and it opens up to a chotzer that is wider than itself. He says the karpef would be then osir. That Rabbi Zeir said, I would agree, because here you don't have a roof to say pitikra of Yari V'Soisim. So over here you would have a situation where the karpef would be indeed greater than 2 so. Maski for law Rabbi. My time, but the first Gemara asks, Hoyel va'avir chotzer mi yatra, because the space of the chotzer will add on to the karpef, whereby it's going to be beyond the 2 saw that it was. Maski for Rav Yosef v'chi avir hamuter loy oisroi. Ask Rabbi Yosef that granted that normally, according to Rabbi Shimon, you can go ahead and metaltil from a karpef to a chotzer, but over here, why should it therefore be a problem? If you can go ahead and metaltil from a karpef to a chotzer, the karpef over here is open to now a chotzer. The chotzer itself cannot then, that which is mutter the carrion can be oiser the karpef. So why should it be a problem? In other words, again, here we have a karpef that has been breached into the chotzer. You can carry from a karpef to a chotzer according to Rabbi Shimon. So now that there's a breach, why should that chotzer which was permitted to be carried into now make it osir? After all, the chotzer is a residential area, and that's a place where you can go ahead and metaltel. So why would it be a problem to metaltel from the karpef to the chotzer? Omar le Abaye keman. Abaye now says, like whom do you say? Rabbi Shimon, like we just explained, that Rabbi Shimon permits carrying from a karpef to a chotzer. So says Abaye to Rabbi Yosef, but still, even according to Rabbi Shimon that permits carrying from a karpef to a chotzer, still, when there's a breach entirely into the chotzer, there'll be a problem over here, even according to Rabbi Shimon. The Rabbi Shimon nami ha'ika avir makom mechitzos, because by having the breach into the chotzer, that 2 saw karpef will then have an additional space beyond 2 saw. The Omer Rav Chizda karpef shenifrat b'meloi lechotzer, and he supports himself with what Rav Chizda said. Rav Chizda said a karpef that is breached entirely into a chotzer, chotzer muteris ve'karpef oser. The chotzer remains muter, but the karpef is oser. So now he explains chotzer my taimo muteris. Why is it that the chotzer remains muter? Because the isle gifufe, because the chotzer has gipufe. Gipufe means it has the sides. When we said that the karpef is breached entirely into the chotzer, since the chotzer is wider than the karpef, when it's breached, there still are some 2 sides that are still on either end, which means that the chotzer really has a certain entranceway. We look at it as an entranceway which permits the chotzer to be separated from the karpef, and therefore the chotzer is permitted, but the karpef is osir. But if you say that this is the explanation of Rabbi Chizda, then you can really explain it the opposite way as well, meaning that if the karpef was indeed wider than the chotzer, so then when it would breach into the chotzer, so then you would have a space on both sides of the karpef, which would be an entrance way permitting the karpef, as opposed to what we said before, the exact opposite scenario. Ella, rather what you have to say, Rav Chisda's intention is as follows. What he meant is, Mishum da'aminin ze aver mechitzas miyatroi, v'ze ein aver mechitzas miyatroi. What he meant to say is like this. The reason why the karpef is osir and the chotzer is mutter is because when the karpef breaches into the chotzer, that means that the karpef was too saw. Once the breach happens, the wall is no longer there. So then that entire wall that's missing, now we add the space of where that wall once was, which now adds on to the 2 saw, so whereby the karpef is beyond 2 saw. Whereas the chotzer itself is not a problem because it's a residential area. So therefore, the chotzer is mutter, but the karpef would be also, and this is what Rabbi Zera said, I would agree that in such a scenario, the karpef would be also because over here, it'll be greater than 2 saw. Says the Gemara, Vaiter hahu bustina, dehava samich leguda da apadna. If you have an orchard, the orchard was such that it was made and started to have walls around it, and before the 4th wall was enclosed, it was adjacent to a large house. The large house, they decided that maybe we'll then allow the people in the house to then be able to then go into the orchard and be able to then metayil in the orchard. So when they made the last wall of the orchard, which was really the last wall, the 4th wall of the house, which was adjacent to the orchard, so then they closed it, and it was then for residential purposes. So even though the orchard was more than 2 saw, but since that wall, that 4th wall, which was the wall of the house, was closing it for residential purposes, therefore you were able to metaltil within the orchard. Says the Gemara, Nafal Ashisa Baraisa da Apadna. The wall that was adjacent to this large house then fell down, whereby they no longer have this wall closing the orchard for residential purposes, and now you can no longer metaltel freely in the orchard. Sava Rabbibi Lemeima, Rabbibi, who was really the son of Abaye, he thought to say, I have a way to explain how this can then still be permitted and can still permit the tiltul in the orchard. Because lismoich agudo gavayasa, you can then go ahead and rely on the wall that is the inner wall of the house. Because now that there was a breach, meaning that the wall fell down, that was adjacent to the orchard, you can go ahead and take the back wall and use that because that's enclosing not only the house, but this is also now enclosing the orchard. Says the Gemara, Omar le Rav Papi. Rav Papi was very dissatisfied with this answer that Rabbibi brought. And he said to him the following, you are the son of Abaye. Now Abaye is from the descendants of Eli HaKohen. He's from base Eli. And there was a certain curse that the descendants of Eli would die young. So Rav Papi says to Rabbibi, Mishum da'osu mimiloi amisu mili milioso, because you are short-lived, you're going to give an explanation that is really short-lived. Really, he was coming to say that your explanation is no good. Because Hanach mechitzois legavoy avidon, lebaroi lo avidon. Those mechitzas that you're referring to, what's on the inner part of the house, those were made for the house itself. They weren't made to have an enclosure of the orchard to be a residential karpef. And therefore, those are not going to be, that wall is not going to be satisfactory to then close in the orchard to allow a person to metaltel freely in that orchard.